nuclear protest, Albert Bigelow attempted to sail his boat into the nuclear test sites in the Pacific to disrupt nuclear weapons testing in the late 50s. Conscientious objectors who, instead of enlisting for the draft during the Vietnam War, fled to Canada. Work in the sanctuary movement, where illegal immigrants were given sanctuary in churches. The Monkey Wrench Gang and Dave Foreman's Earth First movement, where they, among other things, trespassed to unroll a fake plastic crack down the front of Glen Canyon Dam. Tim DeChristopher, who bid on oil and gas leases without ever intending to pay for them. The ATV Back to Utah, Take Back Utah protest, where ATVers illegally drove up the Pariah Riverbed in May 2009 to protest the government's decision to enforce the law prohibiting such off-road use.
I'm not very
Not too many hands there. The Right to Life movement, where protesters protesting legalized abortion might chain themselves in front of an abortion clinic to prevent women from entering. Credit card protesters, individuals who refuse to pay their credit cards in protest of unfair practices of credit card companies. Tax protesters, a person who withholds a portion of his income tax to protest the militarization of American budget. Okay. To help us think through what is civil disobedience, when is it justified, when is it effective, let's start and hear a little bit about the origin and ideas, different strains of where civil disobedience came from. Michael Popich.
Thank you. Let me give a very generalized account of some of the sort of traditions behind, or that supported this idea of civil disobedience, though maybe Thoreau coined the term late in the game. It actually goes back to biblical roots, and actually you can find examples of civil disobedience in classical Greek literature as well. A couple of the most famous in Greek literature, of course, Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods and giving it to human beings, and then there's the famous Antigone example, which is very parallel to some biblical reasons for civil disobedience. Namely, she is prohibited from burying her brother, and that is a result of an edict by Creon that tries to supersede a kind of what she considers a higher law. And she breaks the edict of Creon and suffers the penalty, which is one of the common elements of the history of civil disobedience. People who do it must be willing to accept the penalties for breaking the law. Then in the biblical tradition, there are cases like, well, the Hebrew women in Exodus 1 and 2, for example, who disobeyed the order of Pharaoh to kill all the male infants. And then there is, well, some people use the example of Jesus in the cleansing of the temple, which is breaking civil law, or at least certain civil arrangements and religious arrangements enforced by Roman authorities, that calls attention to, for example, the misuse of the temple. And of course, Jesus wasn't alone. It was part of actually a long-going conflict about the misuse or not of the temple grounds for the purposes of collecting tax and other non-religious activities. But I want to talk a little bit about the Christian Jewish tradition of civil disobedience, or at least the biblical roots for it. And Bill mentioned one pro-life demonstration type activity, for example, that would seem to fit within this model. There's actually moderate pro-lifers who think that's not civil disobedience. And I want to explain how that comes about from the biblical tradition. In the biblical tradition, the idea of a higher law is identified, of course, as God's law. And what has to be the case to justify, at least as one of the necessary conditions, an act of civil disobedience, is that the commands of God and the human positive law commands, either as required or prohibited action, be directly in conflict with one another. Now, if you go to the pro-life demonstration, moderate Christians or Jews who are maybe pro-life but not in favor of that kind of civil disobedience would point out that there isn't any direct conflict involved in the abortion case. Why? Well, because the abortion ruling of Roe Wade is actually about a permission and neither requires nor prohibits anything that directly contradicts the law of God. While one may find that the permission is in contradiction to some other prohibitions, depending on how you read passages in the scriptures, nevertheless, the human law doesn't require or demand or prohibit anything that God's law otherwise would directly contradict. So in order from a Jewish Christian tradition, that civil disobedience, one of the necessary conditions historically has been that there has to be this direct conflict, which of course makes a lot of the issues that Bill mentions somewhat problematical in the sense that you're inclined to think in a moral, intuitive sense that there is something amiss here, morally amiss, and the one has to do something in an overt fashion to call attention to that. In that case, probably, there are two other traditions that have developed, somewhat influenced by the biblical tradition, that could provide some support for such intuitions about some of these other actions being legitimate cases of civil disobedience. One is the natural rights tradition, and more recently there is the human rights tradition. The natural rights tradition is in fact also connected with the idea of the inner conscience, which developed with the Protestant Reformation, especially in the 17th and 18th century. You've probably heard people say, I can't in good conscience do this or that. Well, that's this idea of a kind of direct connection internally to this notion of God's higher law, but which may not be explicit or spelled out in some direct way. And that also combines with this idea that some actions or policies or laws on the part of government, perhaps, might be in direct violation with the idea of the rights of human beings, considered simply as human, which are sometimes argued to be absolute in the sense of being inalienable. So some law or policy, whether or not there's any explicit divine command to the contrary, would in fact actually jeopardize, impair, or prevent people from enjoying or having the freedom to enjoy something guaranteed as a natural right, then civil disobedience into this alternative or parallel development would be justified. And in a similar vein, the human rights tradition, though without the appeal to any kind of divine command or theological foundations, could actually be employed to justify civil disobedience in a way that could be shaped as the violation of guaranteed human rights under, say, UN charters of one kind or another. If you look at the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, signed pretty much by a number of nations with a few notable exceptions in 1948. I think these notable exceptions, the Soviet Union at the time, Russia now, and the United States have since signed it. But that declaration actually guarantees in the preamble or implies a guarantee that certain kinds of rights to do, not simply freedoms from, certain kinds of harmful conditions and so forth are guaranteed. And policies, laws, and perhaps even economic practices now in some way impair or threaten people's enjoyment of these basic rights, that would be a justified foundation for civil disobedience apart from the biblical tradition. Given that there is, of course, and this would be true back to the biblical tradition, all peaceful, non-disruptive acts or ways of changing or calling attention to policies that need to be changed or laws that need to be challenged have been attempted, then consequently civil disobedience, perhaps direct action or something stronger, may be required in order to change what is otherwise morally indefensible practices, policies, or laws. Now that's kind of a précis of stuff I had planned to develop a greater length. I'm teaching a course in May